here. Jay's Analysis, Esoteric Hollywood, a bunch of other books he's written. He's a scholar of religion and politics. He's the host of an amazing series of broadcasts. He also broadcasts with on Alex Jones' program. Jay, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Charles. Glad to be back. We always have good in-depth conversations, so honored to be here with you.
Thank you. I really always like to hear from the latest books that you're delving into, and your sort of book report on them. And they're often books that are written by high placed establishment figures, which gives them a certain weight as opposed to maybe a book by some right winger like me or someone else. And they influence our culture in very profound ways. So, I think that recently you talked about Walter Lippmann, the one of the most significant journalists of the 20th century, sort of one of the founders of the Council on Foreign Relations, and some of his insights in terms of how the what I would call the informal aristocracy, the amoral rulers of the universe here. People who are implementing some of the weird things that we see happening, especially in the past couple of years. I mean, as manifested by his work, things like lockdowns, stolen elections, neutering children, and parents bringing their children in for this as if it's a virtue, and other very bizarre developments on an international scale. People like Walter Lippmann influenced those things, and he had a lot to do with it. So I want to just talk a little bit about his book and what he's up to, what he wrote about.
Yeah, I just got Public Opinion in the mail the other day. I haven't read it yet. I'm excited to read it, but he was one of these Tavistock theorists, and what I did read was a couple books on Tavistock. Finally, one of them is the one that's kind of hard to get, the Dr. John Coleman book. I finally read that, and he went into a lot of detail about the history of what was first Wellington House, which was sort of the World War I British, I guess we call it a psychological warfare department, and it morphs into what we call Tavistock Clinic, and then that becomes Tavistock Institute, and they're studying shell shock and all these kinds of things. And what they learn is that you can weaponize a lot of the things that they're studying. And Lippmann is one of the key figures who's connected to that. And he writes the book in 1920, Public Opinion. So I've read Bernays' Propaganda, but I haven't read Public Opinion yet. So I got to go back and read, because it actually precedes Bernays' Propaganda. But what they figured out at that time was that it was really easy to manipulate people on the basis of polling at that time. Not just polling, also advertising and a lot of other domains as well. But they realized that if people were told that their opinions were not with the majority, most people would want to be with the majority. So polling was always kind of a manipulation technique, they noted. And this led to a lot of tricks and tactics, as you said, which in terms of lockdowns, we know that, for example, the Canadian government was using psychological warfare techniques to convince everyone that, through fear and whatnot, that you needed to be not just social distance, but also locked down for this arbitrary amount of time. We know that Harvard was putting out research in the last couple of years about using those same psychological warfare techniques to scare people. And really, again, that goes back to the Bryce report about World War I, which was, according to Coleman, pretty much fictionalized, that the Kaiser was not a figure who was intentionally trying to kill everyone, but H.G. Wells had basically helped create this notion that he was. So this led to World War I. Then it was a war that the elite wanted to occur. And so a lot of those same techniques and tactics have been reused. For example, in the Gulf War, Dr. John Coleman argues that the techniques of the throwing the babies out of the incubators and this kind of stuff, that all of that Gulf War Saddam propaganda was just kind of repeated old propaganda, that the Kaiser was the butcher of wherever, and then they made, Saddam's the butcher of Baghdad and all this kind of stuff. So the same techniques, we kind of see them rolled out and used over and over and over. And it's not just the war techniques. It's also the techniques to scare people into things that would be considered typically irrational. The constant wearing, think of Fauci saying basically contradictory things. The mask doesn't work. It does work. It doesn't work. It does work. Oh, you need to wear 2 masks. It's just always kind of a contradictory thing. And that can actually be a technique of kind of destabilizing and getting people just acclimatized to pure worship and acceptance of authority. It's almost like the authority sort of makes it true just by saying it.
Right. So it's kind of like a mass following type of genre where people just are generally accepting a certain level of conditioning. I mean, I think World War I was supposed to usher in a new world order. And Edward Mandell House was one of the architects in the Wilson administration. But it didn't really work out that way when the United States refused to go into the League of Nations, thanks to Massachusetts Congressman Henry Cabot Lodge, who, while he was a globalist, nevertheless he had a personal grudge against Wilson. He didn't want to have Will, so it worked in our favor. And so I think that they went back to the drawing board and figured out how to further, I don't know, colonize the brain of enough people and control the media as a way to create this mass hypnosis. And they began implementing it in a much more ratcheted up way after World War II, with, as you say, the Tavistock Institute in London, MK Ultra in the United States, the Polytechnic Group in Russia, in the Soviet Union, Canada had their, over at McGill with Cameron and some of these other people. And they, I think, embraced some of the techniques that had actually been patented by the Nazis, right? I mean, the Nazis were brilliant at mass control of their people. They would have an example with these great nighttime rallies where they would control all the senses, the smells, the sights, the sounds. They'd have blaring music. They'd have, bonfires. It was very choreographed. And then they'd come out, and Adolf Hitler had this technique where he would, he'd start out real softly and he'd be seeming almost like he was going to faint, and then he gradually build and build and build. And by the end of the thing, he was like flying all over the place, and, zig heiling and just, and women were fainting. I mean, I understand women were having orgasms. I mean, it was like a mass experience. I think some of that was replicated with Obama, but that's not quite like that. But the thing is that I think that those techniques of mass mind control, to use them for lack of a better term, were embraced after World War II by this establishment. And that's the kind of stuff that they used to scare people with all these lies about the virus, to get people to accept a stolen election and to demonize anyone who disagreed with it. To censor people and have that viewed as a virtue, and to push other of these sort of internationalist agendas that are, I mean, in my opinion, have reached a level of evil now and satanic aspect that, as I said, children are being neutered. I mean, it's gotten to be that bad.
Absolutely, and you're right that I'm trying to remember which one of the Tavistock clinic theorists. There were several of them that were really prominent. There was Dr. Kurt Lewin, there's Dr. John Rawling Rees, there's figures, even I didn't even realize this, but that they had set up their whole American version of this at the University of Michigan. But it actually does make sense because in Douglas Valentine's Phoenix Program book, he was talking about that the CIA was actually running the war in Vietnam out of University of Michigan. So
yeah, literally,
Michigan had I think it's called the IPR, Institute for Policy Research, or one of these acronym things was set up there, and a bunch of the Tavistock people would come and teach and lecture at this Michigan Institute. And some of these theorists, as you noted, yeah, they were absolutely, it had nothing to do with the ideology. It had to do with the technique. So they were very enamored with the technique of Hitler. And again, I just don't remember which one of the Tavistock theorists that it was, but one of them or two of them really were. So they absolutely studied that and tried to figure out what were the usages of, and Mussolini too, because he was always pounding the table. And
oh, yeah, sure. these are all tactics. And I think that also Lewin, didn't he set up this institute in Bethel, Maine, that trains change agents for
Yeah,
education, and that
exactly. I
part of
forgot
that
about that.
in B.F. Skinner with his Skinner box, and the switch over of our education system to behaviorism versus
Yes.
cognitive learning and helping people think independently. And also MK Ultra launched the LSD program, right? I mean, who's a Jolion West in Los Angeles started handing out tabs of LSD, and you had Timothy Leary and Ram Dass at Harvard doing the same thing, and a lot of this was, and you've written about Aldous Huxley and his international chemical concentration camp. This idea of altering people's consciousness, loosening people's um, understanding of Judeo-Christian moral and ethical values, and moving people away from their, I don't know, their sense of sovereignty under God. This was, weakening people's resolve. Not to mention, we should throw in Kinsey there at University of Indiana in Bloomington, and
Yep.
how he was put up on the cover of Time magazine by Luce and by the people that ran that as being this great middle American guy, this sort of exemplar of American manhood. And meanwhile, he's there going to gay bars and prisons and interviewing people and holding that up as being the example of the American male and the American female. So
Yes, he was funded by Rockefeller Foundation too, and I just reread, and we did a walkthrough, my buddy Frank and I, of All of Brave New World. And one thing I didn't notice was the how can I say this? The figure of Mustafa Mon, the world socialist controller, he's intentionally pictured as a kind of we'll say antichrist type of figure, and he openly promotes the notion of all forms of PEDO. We'll say, right? There's a scene in the book at the end of chapter 3 where he's where there's a text in the Bible where it says, the Gospels, Jesus says, "Let the children come unto me," and he's mimicking that and saying, "Let the little ones come unto me," and it's in the context of the chapter where the youth have erotic play. So it's a play on the text in the gospel, but the point is that Huxley is saying that as the text says, that we will rule them by brains, and not by brains but by buttocks, right? So he's saying that government's an affair of sitting, not hitting. You rule the brains and the brain and the buttocks, never with the fist. So the idea of the sort of chemical concentration camp that you're talking about comes about ironically in the book. They have this story where they said there was this past economic collapse at some point, and that led to the initiation of this whole new system of the technocratic Brave New World Order. So the only reason I went into all that was just that speaking of Huxley, I had not noticed the first time I read it many years ago that there's a conscious retooling of how they see the youth. And in the text, the youth, not only do they engage in total free sexual whatever, they don't have parents intentionally, because parenthood, mother and father, would give you the idea of allegiance other than the state. And Huxley talked about that in a later essay. He said that he realized that in this future dystopia, they would have to have children born in the lab, because that would mean that you don't have any other allegiances. Your only allegiance would be to the state, because the state created you. So that's a very conscious, known project. And you mentioned in your email, Julian, when Julian wrote The Philosophy of UNESCO, he's essentially laying that type of a worldview out. I mean, he's saying basically that, but he's not presenting it as a dystopia. Obviously, he's saying that this is what UNESCO, as the cultural arm of the United Nations, will do. And my wife is reading a book. You would find this interesting, probably, by a woman from the 80s or 90s. Her name is Constance Cumby, but she wrote a critique of the New Age. She wrote a critique of the New Age, and the funny part is that a lot of the New Agers, the things that they say about the future coming era, they're exactly what the Reich was saying. So what Hitler was
Right.
saying about the Reich, and and I've read a speech by Hitler where he says that the God of the Bible, and including the Jewish Old Testament, the law of Moses or whatever, he says that God is a problem. That God has to be gotten away with. So we need a new type of deity for the new era. Anyway, irony is that all of the New Agers basically have the same basic root philosophy that the Reich has.
Yeah, I mean, and by the way, it didn't just appear out overnight there either. I mean, in the Christian world, it goes back to the Illuminati of Adam Weishaupt, who talked about abolishing all clerical authority, all governing authority, and in Judaism, it goes back to this false messiah Shabtai Zvi, who was an antinomian, which is a word that was actually coined by Martin Luther to describe someone who wanted to overthrow the order, the logos of the universe. There we go.
Well, her philosophy, right? Her theosophy, which is very it basically says that the God of Moses is evil, right?
Right. And this is what Shabtai Zvi turned all of the entire Torah on its head. And he had a huge impact within Judaism, a very ugly and dark impact. And it created this poisonous strain that eventually would come to dominate Judaism today, unfortunately. I actually wrote about this in my latest book, The Case for Jexit, the American Jewish Exodus from the Left. But the point I'm making here is that these were the sort of modern avatars of what we're dealing with now. This is what led to the French Revolution, eventually the Russian Revolution, the Nazi movement, and now we have this international order. Also, I don't know quite the connection between that and the Anglo-American establishment of Cecil Rhodes, but I'm sure that it's there.
Well, here's what I would say, and this is what I've been looking at recently. So I think that Blavatsky was actually an operative of the British establishment. She seems to have, because her Theosophical Society, she's running in the circles of, she's a Fabian socialist, so she's in the circles of the Fabian socialists. And that's why she had all these connections to the Soviet leadership, because many of them were interested in theosophy as well, like Roerich. There's a really good essay I'll send you by a historian who pointed out her connections to British intelligence and whatnot. So, but her philosophy of theosophy, just as setting aside the espionage element of it, her philosophy is what would influence both the Reich and the New Agers. And so basically everybody in today, in the 60s counterculture movement as well, the whole New Age movement of that, the sort of pop version of it, even that still stems from Blavatsky's theosophy.
Right, and she established, along with a few other people, the Theosophical Society in New York, which is still there. It was a merge between Darwin's theories and kind of a scientism and crackpot kind of occultic faith. Right. She invented the concept of the Aryan Superman. Who would live to be 200 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, super strength, super cosmic consciousness. And there was a major influence on the Nazis and, as you say, on the New Age movement. It also, her follower, I think it was Annie Besant, basically started the Lucifer Society, which is now known as the Lucis Trust. And that is the main philosophical guidepost for the United Nations and much of the world's elite. And if anyone thinks that I'm talking out of my backside here, check out their website. It's it has everything that's going on right there at the Lucis Trust. So these are the forces that have created that have been embraced by today's world rulers. They are amoral. I would argue they are satanic, and that they kind of serve as a revolving door between governments and these massive private entities and secret societies like the Council on Foreign Relations and the foundations and the whole rotten ruling edifice that has now encompassed the entire world like a gigantic octopus.
Absolutely. I think that you can't understand the 20th century and where we are now without understanding that, and particularly the the secret society element's important because a lot of these societies kind of had their origins in stuff that was secret back at, the time of the French Revolution. I'm sure you're familiar with Fire in the Minds of Men. That's a classic.
Oh yes, and James H. Billington.
And
It's a very important book because he's like a scholar, liberal, establishment guy. I think he's Harvard and Yale. He was one of the I think he was the head of the Woodrow Wilson Institute at Princeton. He was appointed by Reagan to be Librarian of Congress. I mean, he's a very kind of reared. This isn't some right wing nut here. This is somebody who basically this book
Right.
goes over the whole secret edifice from the French Revolution to the Russian Revolution.
Exactly. Yeah, and the chapter 4 gets into what you're talking about, where it's literally about the occult origins, because at the time of these early figures like Buonarroti, he says that they had to have secret societies because it was still, they would have gotten in trouble. They couldn't be public about their revolutionary views. And then he says that Freemasonry was a great tool at this time for people to have, these underlying revolutionary current views. And then he goes into the actual quote Illuminists that people always talk about the Illuminati, but the Weishaupt Illuminists of this time, he says, were actually just proto-communists, and they felt that through fire worship, and they didn't actually believe in worshiping fire, but fire was a symbol for them of the fire in the minds of men, which is the revolutionary faith, and the idea that you could take something on the model of the Jesuits. It's not Jesuit run, but the way that the Jesuits structured their system and they had cells and whatnot, you could set up a system like that. And he talks about Zoroastrian Manichaeanism because it was dualistic, and there was always a tension between principles. And this goes back to the ancient world, which I've forgotten, or I may not have even known this, but I recently did a lecture on the pre-Socratics, and I was reading about Anaximander, and Anaximander had a dialectical evolutionary philosophy. It almost reads just like Darwin, back in 500 years before, the time of Christ. So you've got basically this notion that the metaphysics of the universe itself being in constant evolutionary tension, which is the everything is flux, perpetual constant flux. That's the philosophy that Weishaupt and his society embodies. But they actually note that it goes back to the ancient Greeks, because Anaximander said that, I don't know if you've heard this, forgive me for repeating it, but this is crazy. It says that I thought I had it pulled up. Let's see. Excuse me. So Anaximander said that here it is. All life comes out of the sea, and by the means of adaptation to the environment, the present forms of animals all evolve. Anaximander made a clever guess at the origin of mankind. The beginning, man was born from animals, and then of another species. Other animals quickly found nourishment for themselves. Man alone needs a lengthy period of suckling, so that had he originally been as he is now, he would have never survived. So man had to come from these, more primitive animalian species. He does not explain this difficulty for evolutionists, which is that how man survived in these transition stages. The doctrine of Anaximander, however, was based on this idea that all life came from a single source from the sea through evolutionary adaptation. I think we do adapt to the environment, but that doesn't mean that
adaptation is not evolution.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a different thing.
That's the classic text.
That's incredible. That's absolutely amazing, because that's basically the theory of evolution in a nutshell, and it brings us to today, where and by the way, the obvious and natural emanation from the theory of evolution is eugenics. Yeah. I mean, after all, if we're all evolving species and we're at different rungs in the evolutionary ladder, then it would therefore be the most basic moral imperative to evolve the human species and eliminate people who are seen as lesser evolved. That's, if you accept that premise. And that brings us, of course, to today with transhumanism and this idea that is discussed right here at Harvard by Ray Kurzweil and his institute. I interviewed someone from there a while ago, and they were so cult-like, it was unbelievable, that he wants the evolution, the next rung of evolutionary development is a new kind of a man that is sort of half human, half computer, half computer chips, and basically the human being will be monitored by these computer elements to have all of the aspects of their health, their consciousness, everything sort of interacting as a hybrid human being. This is the future. And I'm not kidding around here. I mean, you can check this out. This is MIT they've actually taken them offline now, but there's a period when they had a lot of this stuff up and running. And one of the major components of this over there, by the way, was Jeffrey Epstein. There you go. Ray Kurzweil. Yes. I mean, and they are well-meaning, but they basically want to resurrect Blavatsky's Ubermensch.
Yeah, another figure that's really crucial to this, which I know you know, but I finally got a hold of this book. So I wanted this book for so many years, and I finally got it. I don't know. Have you heard of this book, Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition?
No, I'll check it out.
So this Hegelian scholar guy has basically gone into the history of how Hegel's philosophy was influenced by Neoplatonism and medieval Kabbalism and alchemy.
Sure.
The reason that matters is because this is really important for the transhumanists, because Hegel was basically saying that so there's this ancient problem in philosophy with how do we account for change and identity over time and identity through change. Aristotle's trying to deal with that. The pre-Socratics kind of were dealing with it. And Hegel kind of resurrects this problem because he's a strict idealist, and he thinks that everything's kind of in an evolutionary process. So he's also in a way an evolutionary philosopher, but he's not a materialist. In fact, he's totally idealist. But what's interesting is that he thought that all of the dialectics would be working themselves out to a point when all of reality and even matter itself would become self-conscious. So it's sort of like all reality is God in process, and that this God in process would work itself out to the omega point where everything becomes God. So God comes to know himself, basically. That's actually what Kurzweil says, is that I don't believe in God yet, because God will eventually be when the transhumanist event occurs at the omega.
Transhumanists invent God, basically, right?
He calls it the singularity. Hegel calls it the omega point, right? So I think they're talking about the same thing. And this book is showing that no, actually Hegel was, I don't know what type of esoteric society he was initiated into, but basically the same type of dialectical, mystical philosophy which is naturalized in the Illuminists. I don't think they don't believe in a God, but they are influenced by Plethon, who's a Byzantine atheist Neoplatonist. So there's a strand of Neoplatonism amongst the Byzantines, and Plethon influences Spinoza. Spinoza then influences.
Spinoza was the kind of the pantheism. I mean, the idea that God is in everything, and that it's in the rock, it's in the ocean, it's in the land, and that all is sort of equal, and all is going to just become aware. And this also gets into the false messiah Shabtai Zvi and his idea of the broken shards are going to release consciousness, and this I mean it's been around for a long time. It goes back to this is Mystery Babylon stuff, basically. I mean, it's
so God is not a creator distinct from the creation,
right?
God is like you said, in process, and so this is process philosophy. That you can see some of this in Alfred North Whitehead as well. And just like Hegel saying that all of this, the spirit will evolve into being self-conscious of itself, even inanimate matter, right? Even rocks and trees eventually will become God. That's essentially what Spinoza was saying, because he was really influenced by this figure Plethon. There's a book I forgot to bring in here that's really good. It's about this figure of Plethon coming out of Byzantium and influencing Spinoza and Weishaupt with this philosophy of process and God in process in the world. God is the world in process. And that's actually just ancient Egyptian philosophy. The Egyptians had a form of pantheism where they said that God is Ra, or what he is the all, right, which is the world too.
Well, I mean, that's probably why Spinoza was not only excommunicated from Judaism by a council of rabbis, but he was also exiled from the Protestant Dutch faith, and the Catholics sent up a representative to meet with him, and they went back and said, we agree. So one time all three religions agreed that Spinoza's influence was like antithetical to an understanding of a creator of the universe who did just that, created the universe and separated and made a creation. Not isn't the universe isn't the creator.
Right. This is why the Platonic view is really what underlies this, because Plato's basically saying that the world is an emanation of the monad or the one, right? Plato says that in the Timaeus, and so the philosophy that underlies the Republic, and then his later work where he talks about what the laws, and he says that you need to have a secret society that runs, goes to the Council of Night. You have a secret shadow government that runs society, and they meet at night and they do reconnaissance and they figure out like who it's literally a shadow government meeting at night.
It's kind of like the deep state.
It is the deep state, but it's in Plato's system, it's an outworking of the denial of the creator creature distinction, right? So this world is an emanation of the higher realm, and there's no it's not created, it's an eternally emanated realm. And so it's going to, in Plato's system, have to bear like everything in society, including the state, right? The state is the ultimate instantiation of God. In Plato's system, it's the instantiation of reason for society. Then it has to be structured in that way, where there's a tier where communism is an integral part of the system. So what I'm saying is that the emanationist philosophy, whether it's Plato or whether it's Hegel, I don't know what Spinoza's view of the state was, but the point is that if you look at Hegel says that the state is the march of God in history. It is God. So, however,
he actually elevated the concept of a man-made state, which the American idea is that the state is supposed to be subservient to the sovereign people under God. It's just a vehicle to, kind of maintain the order so that we can be freer. He worshipped the power of the state as almost its own life. And I think that it was Oswald Spengler who even went a step further and basically said that the state has a life like a human being. It's born, it has maturity, it has a height of power, and then it declines and dies. And that, it's almost like these become entities in and of themselves. They're not just vehicles. As we see it.
Well, you're right. In the Platonic view, for example, everything has an essence or a spirit behind it, including things like the state and including things like cultures or societies, right? So, for example, Spengler talks, I think Spengler was probably, I'm not 100% positive, but I've detected kind of a Hegelian influence there, where he seems to think that the reason that a society has a life cycle is that it actually has a spirit behind it, has its own kind of an essence behind it. So there was an essence to the Babylonian society, the ancient Middle Eastern societies, which he calls them Magian societies, that they had a magical worldview.
Magi. That's what so
he tries to pick out these things that he thinks are essential to those worldviews. He says that modern Western society and man is Faustian, in that it has this impetus to create technology and, the Faustian bargain, basically, to have dominance and power. And I do think that if you like, for example, if you read the book of Daniel, Daniel characterizes civilizations as, according to the statue there.
Right. And the clay toes, and then they move up to the different stages. I
think that, and Jeremiah does it too, where he talks about the four beasts. So we can talk about these cultures and societies, but what Spengler's doing is absolutizing history, because he's actually a historical cultural relativist. So he absolutizes the historical phenomena and manifestations. and he doesn't think that there's any, like, everything is culturally relative for him. So, for
Mhm.
example, if you're an ancient Greek, you can't understand anything in, say, Babylon or in Rome. You could never understand, because they're different spirits, different
I see.
zeitgeists, right?
Right.
So
And then
that
everything becomes relative in that world, and that's, of course, the basis of the communist theory of exploitation, that everything that we know in this world was created by those who want to exploit us. And not that there isn't. I mean, but the point is that all of reality becomes this figure of imagination created by those who want to exploit us, and that we are dealing with what Marx called false consciousness. That and that, I mean, his solution to it, of course, is to have this new dictatorship, is so that they can create reality. It doesn't
absolutely,
get into the fact that there is an objective reality that exists outside of the manipulative and imperfect hand of man. That's the whole principle of God creating man in his image. We're not gods. We're in the image of God. We can't know all things. That's the sin of the Garden of Eden, where the satanic serpent promised Adam and Eve that they could know all things and basically overthrow God. That was the sin of Nimrod, who wanted to overthrow God by building a tower and going up there with a sword and killing God. That's why God responded by creating all of the different nations with their own language and culture. That's and that's what we have today with this opposition to the new Nimrod movement, which is to create a one world government.
absolutely. All of the systems that we've been talking about, the pantheistic and process philosophy and transhumanist systems, the assumption is that everything has to get past distinctions. Distinctions are somehow bad or wrong. But as you're pointing out, Genesis, law of Moses, the structure that it establishes for the universe and for mankind is that distinctions are good, boundaries are good. There's nothing wrong with having these nations, having boundaries, having distinctions. There's a difference between a man and a woman. There's a difference. These things aren't bad, but all of these
And
systems
they just
give.
are. And also that inequality is good because we're all different. We all bring to the table different skills and different abilities, and there's all these facts. It's very complicated. There's luck, there's all these things that go into a human life that make us different, and that's the idea of homogenizing everyone into one gigantic international ant colony
Yes.
is, I think, something that was uniquely a Marxist contribution to this whole rotten edifice. Marx worked for this weird kind of secretive organization called the League of the Just. Um, it seems to me, not that it matters, but it seems to me that probably has some kind of direct
Social
connection to
justice.
the Illuminati.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think that Billington draws some of those connections there. That now, I mean, today's social justice movement and the idea of wokeism and all that, that's coming out of the same font as you're saying there. And that's
right.
ultimately, here's the thing. So if we have the worldview that there's a creator and that the world has boundaries in it, and that those boundaries are natural and they're okay, they're good, then these people and these philosophies and these systems, if they're in rebellion, if they're against the natural order, if they're against what is laid down as a boundary, we would expect them to go against nature itself. And lo and behold, that's exactly what they're doing. When you were talking about with young people and what
Mhm.
Tavistock Clinic, for example, in the last several years has pushed with changing biology, mutilating young people, that's a rebellion against what is in nature, because it, it's inadvertently a rebellion against God. Because if God did establish distinctions and order and difference between man and woman, then the rebellion against that is a manifestation of rebellion against what's a natural distinction and hierarchy. As you said, nature doesn't fit people to be egalitarian. We might be equal in some senses, but as you said, we're also fitted to be unequal in other senses, and that's okay. There's nothing, it
It's
shouldn't be
just every
bad.
human being is a created unique, is sui generis. We're created in the image of God. The Talmud says that every person is almost like its own universe. We're all, and to kill a person is to destroy a universe. That's why murder is the ultimate capital crime. The thing that it makes me think that maybe we've reached some kind of a tipping point in the world today and in this country, in that there has always been this left conspiracy against nature, and this idea of creating the world government, and they've always been secretive by nature, because if they came out in the open, everybody would forget about it. I'm not going to, they'd be horrified. But I wonder if they haven't reached a point where they have enough people who are either consciously a part of their movement or have been sufficiently conditioned and brainwashed that they can now do things that I would expect them to do. I'm not shocked that they want to change a child's sex. I mean, as awful and as despicable as that is, I mean, that's in a way the ultimate expression of communism, that there is no difference between people. We're all the same, that we can all be interchanged. But what shocks me and disturbs me is how many people not only have gone along with it and how many people have signed on to it, but the fact that the government has reached a point where they not only have endorsed it, and they've not only monetized it, I mean, we're talking about billions of dollars being made, but they have been able to successfully demonize anyone who opposes this now. And, that somehow there's something wrong. It's a complete inversion of reality. I mean, maybe it goes back, some people say it goes back to gay marriage. I don't know. Because obviously two men or two women can't be married, and they wouldn't accept the idea of civil union, which actually is reasonable. Instead, they had to literally, openly, and legally call it a marriage, which it's not. So when you deal with the kind of the codification of something that's not true, then that begins this process by which anything can be declared as true, even though it's not. And so you can say, well, you can become a woman or you can become a man. When obviously that's not possible. And if you disagree with this, you're you're attacked as a bigot or as something. It's just what do you? I mean, have we reached that kind of a tipping point? Do you think?
Yeah, it's like when Jonah goes to Nineveh and he says that the God says these people don't know their left hand from their right hand. So to me, that suggests that societies can get to the point where they're so lost that there's absolutely they don't even have they've strayed away from the inner basic sense of right and wrong that I think we should have stamped on our being, like you said, by being made in the image of God. We kind of have an innate some sense of right and wrong, but you can be propagandized and brainwashed to where you have no sense at all. You're completely sort of without any moral compass at all. And I think that's what's crazy, is that we're getting to that point where it's not just relativism and no moral compass, but you actually can be made to be evil, like where you're actually promoting and constantly sort of just working towards what is absolutely evil. I can't think of anything more evil than really harming the youth in this way who don't deserve it. They haven't done anything yet to deserve that. So,
right. And the thing that really is disturbing is that you have people, parents included, and teachers, right, and generally average people who mean well, who have come to believe that there's a virtue in this, that it's not a problem, that this isn't, that this actually, that they're marching in to do it. It reminds me of the same way people marched in to get the vaccine, but that's another subject. To have their children do this. It's just, it's really, I mean, it's an interesting thing that you say about the lessons of Jonah, that people, they just don't know their right hand from their left at this point. And that you have to kind of handle it that way. They're not thinking that they're doing something evil, but they've obviously been at some point conditioned by evil.
Absolutely. So, yeah. I think I was reading about there was a study that someone had done on people that signal their virtue, and not just virtue signaling, but the idea of virtue signaling with victim status. And the paper was analyzing a bunch of different experiments that they'd done where people were more apt to help or to contribute to someone if that person signified or explained that their situation was one where they were virtuous and not just inadvertently the victim of a crime or something. So if they were at a charity event and they were, shot by a gunman or something like that, and it paralyzed them, versus were they going to the strip club and they got shot. So the people who signified that they were doing virtuous things got a lot more attention and a lot more help, right? And so there's this tendency that people will, and the paper was making the argument that a lot of people who, there's a section of the population who will use this as a tactic. They don't even have to necessarily have been virtuous, but they will signify in the society that has a preference for equalitarianism or egalitarianism, as the modern West does. They will signify their victim status to achieve social rank, and that the people are cunning enough to actually know that. So they're not just, so there's a section of society that's cunning enough now to constantly promote the notion of victim status to attain to social status. And
it's absolutely critical. I mean, the anything but being like a straight white Christian male is you can conjure up some kind of a victim. Like now, when high school students apply to college, their essays are all about how they had been somehow a victim of something. That's almost across the board. I mean, that's the only thing that's going to fly. They have to tell some kind of a story where they had been, there had been injustice done to them at some level, and that this becomes like a defining factor. Now, we started by talking about Julian Huxley, and Julian Huxley, who was the founder of UNESCO, which at the time promoted itself as the World School Board when it was founded in 1948, he developed this. He was a eugenist. He was pro-Nazi during the war, and he wanted to remarket eugenics in a way that was more palatable, and developed a new consensus that would basically codify Darwinism. But he also developed a new religion, which was secular evolutionism, or I don't know, evolutionary secularism, whatever the hell he called it. And the idea was to colonize all of the world's religions and replace their belief systems and their philosophy and their faith with this new religion, while leaving in place the cultural exteriors. You could continue with the stained glass and the incense and the ceremony, but the actual belief system would become this amorphous humanism, and that would be devoid of or dismoored from objective ideas of morality and sin. And I mean, I see that even here in my own synagogue, where the rabbi basically on the Shabbos, his sermon is just spouting a lot of kind of psychobabble now. It's that, I mean, you could read one of those silly books from from the 1970s if I want that. I don't need to hear that from the rabbi. And I think that's probably true in most churches too, that the faith has been replaced by this nonsense, by this secular garbage that is not relevant to, and it's actually a trivialization of any kind of faith.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier when we were talking about the Blavatsky and Besant, there's another one of their disciples, Alice Bailey, and she wrote a thing. I finally dug it up. I did a video on it maybe a few months ago, but she had what she called her 10-point plan to infiltrate and change Western religion. Mm-hmm. And she got this, I think, from being in these Blavatsky circles, and they were perceptive enough at that time to realize that they would be able to infiltrate and change the religions. And H.G. Wells says it's the same thing. He has another book called God the Invisible King, and in that book he says that we don't have to necessarily worry about religion in the West. We just have to alter and change it to the global socialist perspective and goal. That's it. Mm-hmm. So we'll leave, like you said, he says, leave the trappings, but just make sure that the leaders basically can be eventually compromised. And compromise can happen not just through kind of individual like espionage or something like this, but compromise through ideological brainwashing as well. And that happened by the capturing of a lot of the religious institutions, the seminaries, and this kind of stuff, right?
Right. National Council of Churches.
Yep. Yep.
Even Catholics, and I always look to Catholicism as a more of a moral standard because it has a hierarchy. But even now, with this present Pope, I mean, I understand he's allowing Communist China to ordain priests, which is a real no-no in the Catholic faith. And it seems to have infiltrated all of religions, most of them anyway. Certainly,
Yeah.
Judaism is long gone. I mean, it's not hopeless, but it's pretty bad.
Do you think that the rise of Reform Judaism was a manifestation of that, or do you think that's something separate?
Yeah, I think it was. I think it was influenced by this Sabbatian movement, which was the aftermath of Shabtai Zvi's apostasy and his exposure as a fraud in 1666. Interestingly, the year. There was a group that went underground that called themselves Sabbatians that wanted to overthrow the Torah. They wanted to overthrow the moral and ethical precepts of Sinai, and they made their way into high places in the Jewish world. And there was kind of a quiet underground civil war, really, that took place in the 17th century between Torah true rabbis and these Sabbatians. And I wouldn't say that the rabbis lost the war, but they've really been put on the back. And the Sabbatians have controlled the high ground of Jewish culture ever since, and they did give birth to both the Reform and Conservative movement, and to America, the people that control sort of institutional Judaism today in America. And it's a heresy. It's really runs completely afoul of the Torah of Sinai.
Was that institutional or subversion or whatever? Was that done primarily through monetary power and like buying off seminaries, or
possibly?
How do you think? How was that occur?
I don't know. I'm not really sure. I mean, that needs to have a real deep dive. But I know that the Sabbatian movement just was able to worm its way into the high places in the same way that the Illuminati wormed its way into Christianity through Masonic lodges and through institutions, and they probably did it through the use of monetary. I don't know enough about it. I know there's been a lot said about the Rothschilds. Probably all true. Probably, but
you think they got into that? I've heard that, but I don't know if it's true. You think
I don't know. I mean, I don't know, but so I think that. I'm not sure that they're quite as uniformal as people think. I think there's some members of that family who we could describe as Sabbatians, and there are others who aren't. So I don't know. I mean, it's possible. I wouldn't dismiss it out of hand. That's for sure. So.
Yeah, I've heard about that. I've not read much on the Sabbatian movement, but I've heard that they had an influence on Reform Judaism, but I didn't know.
They did. Yeah. There's no question. I mean, I don't think. Well, I don't even think that's something that anybody would view as controversial in the Reform movement. So,
well, Julian said that he would take all of what the eugenics movement was saying and make it democracy. He says just retool it as democracy. Just call it democracy.
Give it a new name, and
this is that Lippmann style of just rename stuff, name it something else,
right, and run it up the flagpole. And anybody that disagrees, I mean, this goes back to American historian Charles Austin Beard, who noted in the 1920s that he wrote the book Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace, where he criticized the agenda of the World War I and that the United States was invading itself into world wars. And then he was denounced as an anti-Semite, which is not true. And that's the pattern that was set. You can have anyone who dissented from this line would be attacked in that way. And now it's become almost institutional that anybody that disagrees with the establishment is now, you're racist, you're anti-Semitic, you're a white supremacist, all of that. And these are names that can destroy a person. You could lose your career, you could lose everything. So people, they duck. Everybody puts their head low because nobody wants that. It's a very difficult situation. It's a form of informal tyranny.
Yeah, that's that. That they talked about. Tavistock talked about the groupthink coercion. So one of the things that they really pioneered was groupthink. I
Hmm.
mean, obviously, there's always been groupthink with going back to any
Yeah,
forms
but
of
at least it was groupthink in a good way.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they figured out that
You know?
most people would just default to, and I think that's the real crux of what you're talking about with how do we get so many parents and all these people going along with this, and it's because they believe, they feel that. I mean, there's an element of cowardice I think involved in it too. They think that well, most people support this, I better go along with it, and it's not even true. That's the weird part, is that they talked about in the public opinion manipulation strategies that it didn't even matter if it's true if most people actually had that view, but you could run a poll saying that most people believe this, or when
Right.
most people see the NBC anchor or the CNBC anchor talking about how if you disagree. Remember when they were saying that the parents were terrorists who went to
Oh yeah.
protest? Yeah.
Well, they
So
more than saying it. I mean, the FBI actually was targeting people, and I mean, the Department of Justice had that letter from that radical group, the what is it, the National School Board Association, saying that we want parents to be called domestic terrorists. And Garland was called on the carpet for that in the U.S. Senate by several. I think Ted Cruz really grilled him on that. But yeah, I mean, this is where we are now, is in our politics. I mean, we can
well,
have the opposition leader can be arrested now.
there's an interesting Neoplatonic element to this too, because in the Neoplatonic view, man and woman, because they're distinct, are somehow a lesser status than whatever the higher original non-binary thing was. So if you
Right.
go to, like, there's a place I think in Darwin where he talks about that the original protozoa, I forget how he words it, but it's something like that's if everything came from that, which was a genderless single cell organism or whatever, then whatever we are, right, you don't have to think that we're more complex. You might argue that that was the higher status, and that's why a lot of the people who believe in Baphomet, right, Baphomet has both genders because
That's
it's the
right.
higher.
Baphomet's an image that has both male and female elements.
Yeah.
And
So
of course, this is completely contrary to the book of Genesis, which says
exactly.
that God created men and women in his image. And it does say men and women, it does
Yes.
make a differentiation. But it also says that men and women are equal but different.
Correct. And the
And
way that we view, so in other words, the non-creation Genesis worldview that most people are sort of defaulted to without even knowing it, they have within it sort of a metaphysic that they don't realize that they're based. If all of the, and this, what I'm saying is a lot of the trans stuff is premised on this kind of a philosophy, and people don't even know it, that there's a
yeah,
higher genderless reality, that we are in a lesser reality because we're distinct as men and women. But that's just assuming that, well, maybe God created us as distinct men and women for a reason. Maybe that's not a bad thing.
right. And he created a lot of distinctions and differences and a lot of separations. The entire Torah is filled with that. And, it gets into the whole communist idea of absolute equality, where the entire planet is turned into a gigantic ant colony. So, Jay Dyer, what do you have coming up on your show, and what are you working on these days?
Well, we just did a lecture through the whole history of Western philosophy. I did about 30 hours of lectures over at Richard Grove's Autonomy University. We go to the pre-Socratics all the way up to Nietzsche and the postmodernists. So I did that. Still doing the fourth hour of Alice Jones, mostly on every Friday. Working on a third Esoteric Hollywood book. Maybe that'll be out in the next few months. And actually, believe it or not, I'm reading a bunch of rabbinical texts because I'm going to do a debate with a Muslim, and so I'm reading. Some of these are liberal and some of these are conservative. But have you heard of Daniel Boyarin?
No.
So there's Daniel Boyarin and then Benjamin Sommer. So these are texts that are relevant to the Hebrew conception of God at the time of Moses and the prophets. And did they conceive of God only as a Unitarian God or what? Or was there a notion of multiplicity? So these rabbinical texts are going to be relevant to an upcoming debate with a Muslim, Daniel Hakikachu. He's a pretty well-known Muslim. So those are the
Excellent.
things we're working on.
I'd like to have you back to talk about that maybe in the next, in the coming month
Sure.
to go over that, because that's important stuff and it's interesting. All right, and Joe, where can people, of course, view, get your books and view your program and websites and whatnot?
Yeah, jaysanalysis.com, YouTube, for as long as I'm still allowed to be there, and then Rockfin. I have a channel on Rockfin where everything goes. And
so Rockfin is like you're unleashed, so to speak.
A little more free speech. Yeah, it's free speech there. So, the more edgier stuff, I guess you could say, goes up on Rockfin.
Excellent.
But yeah, those are my main outlets. Also, I've been putting stuff on Twitter. Twitter seems to also be a little freer.
Right.
So I'm getting as many, and Twitter now allows long form content, so you can get a sizable portion, kind of like what you get on YouTube, on Twitter as well now.
Excellent. All right, Jay Dyer, listen, thanks so much for joining me as always. I really appreciate it. It's been an honor and a pleasure.